Bartering is trading without the use of money. So basically, if you give me this, then I will give you that, or do this for you in return. And that's exactly how this project came to be. A good friend of mine named Duffy, he gave me an old Stanley brace and some bits in exchange for some lathe work to create a pair of Swingletrees for an 1860s wheeling ambulance that he was building. Now, a quick brief introduction to my friend Duffy. Duffy is the creator of the Starkville Civil War Arsenal, with the goal of not only preserving actual pieces of American history and educating people on the craftsmanship during that period, but also to continue that level of craftsmanship with period-specific reproductions. He's been working on his wheeling ambulance for a little over 2 years now, and the last piece of the puzzle is to create a doubletree and swingletree assembly. Now, if you're not familiar with those two terms, a swingletree is what a pulling animal is hooked up to, and a doubletree connects the two swingletrees to the tongue of the carriage or the wagon or whatever it is that they're pulling. To start the project, I was provided an old random doubletree and dual swingletree setup to use as reference, Duffy's doubletree that he had already completed to the specifications in the contract, 2 really clear straight grain hickory blanks for the swingletrees, a copy of the build contract and a reference picture of an original, and the hardware that will be used when it's all assembled. Now, my goal at this point was simply to create the swingletrees, and Duffy would handle the hardware. The contract has some specifications, but not all specifications. The length was listed, but not the thickness or the width. So for those dimensions, I chose to get close sizes with the reference pieces that were provided. In the book Fixtures and Chucks for Wood Turning by Doc Green, I read that recessed centering is a safer way to seat lathe centers. And basically this means drilling an appropriate sized counterbore on each end, and that will allow the drive center or live center to be captured. So in the event that the center loosens up and lets go of the piece, the center should still be captured in a counterbore and hopefully prevent the piece from coming off the lathe. This was also acceptable because the blank was about 4 or 5 inches longer than what the final piece needed to be, so I could turn the piece from the center out and then cut off the extra mounting material on each end afterwards. Before mounting on the lathe, I used a highly visible marker to indicate the center, the taper start and stop locations, and also the hardware locations. The first step with the turning was to establish the taper for each of the end ferrules. Because the ferrules were tapered, I started by cutting the extra end material down to the smaller diameter of the ferrule until it fit on with a nice snug fit. Here the ferrule is slipped on backwards, but it confirms that the end location is at the correct diameter for the ferrule. Then the rest of the ferrule taper can be cut little by little, checking the progress as I go. In this orientation, the 2 blue lines on the right indicates the center 4 inches that will not have any taper. Due to the rectangular stock, the center 4 inches will have just a bull nose on the narrow face of the stock and a flat face on the wide face of the stock. After that is established, a gradual taper can be formed between the center 4 inches and the already determined ferrule taper. With one side completed, the other side can be cut the same way, and for consistency's sake, I removed the blank and flipped it end for end so that it'd be cutting in the same direction for each end. It's just a little bit easier for me to duplicate something when I work from the same direction rather than trying to cut left and then trying to cut right. Alright, so I got the first one done, and I'm a little bummed out about it. So it's not horrible, but there's a flaw that I don't like. So basically there's a bull nose top and bottom and a flat spot front and back, and in between these 2 lines there is no taper on the top and bottom. So once we hit this line, then it tapers down to this ring or ferrule, one on either side. And the reason for this no taper in the middle is because that's where the connecting hardware is going to go to connect this to the doubletree. The problem is each one of these ferrules is handmade, and I failed to take into consideration anything that is handmade is going to have more inconsistencies with shaping and sizing than something that's typically machine made. So that being said, I used the exact same one to size both of my tapers. That was the wrong thing to do, and therefore I did not hit my 34-inch length target. Instead, I'm just a little bit shy. So from the end of this ferrule to the end of this one, I'm at 33 and 13/16. So I'm 3/16 of an inch short. Is that really going to affect the overall ambulance project, a recreation of something from the 1800s? No, it's probably not, but still a bummer on my end. I just used the same ring, and darn it, I messed up on the length. So, I'm going to run this by him and see if it's acceptable or not. Other than that, it turned out all right. Of course, we have to cut the ends off, and I'll just do that at the last stage. But bummer. I'll use each individual ring to size each individual taper for the next one. And there you go. Lesson learned. I won't do that again. Hopefully not anyway. The second piece was completed with the same process, and just like with any other woodworking project, you learn from the mistakes of the first one, you make corrections, and the second one is always the better of the two. After the lathe, I used a spoke shave to clean up the tapers just slightly, just to remove any final lathe tool marks. To cut off the extra material, I thought it would be best to remount the pieces in the lathe and then cut a groove at the end of each ferrule to determine the final length. I also made a point to designate which ferrule matches which taper at this point, and then cut off all of the extra material, and then finally clean the ends just slightly. At this point, my work was done, and I gave everything back to Duffy for final painting and then also to attach the ferrules. The end rings ended up being a two-man job, though. The rings are attached with, I guess what I'm calling a twisted spike. I'm not sure exactly what it's called, but it's not twisted enough for me to call it a screw. With a little bit of epoxy, some rotational force, and a brute downward persuasion, the rings are secured to each end of the Swingletrees. Here's what the completed Doubletree assembly looks like. The hand-forged hardware on each end of the Doubletree is particularly interesting in my opinion. On the front side, it's just a basic loop to attach the Swingletree, but on the back side, it has a tapered helix type of a shape, and this is where the chain is attached to connect the Doubletree to the front axle. Due to that helix type shape, the chain has to go forward, up, and twist 180 degrees to be removed. This makes attaching the chain by hand very easy, but also very difficult for the chain to naturally just fall off while in use. So a little more than 2 years after Duffy started his wheeling ambulance, it's finally complete. And we did a photo shoot to document the completed build, so I'll close with just a few of those images scrolling through. And what's more remarkable than seeing a completed built period ambulance is knowing that Duffy isn't a woodworker who decided to take on a huge project. Instead, he's just a guy with a passion for history and sought out the necessary information and skills to complete a massive project like this. For more information on Duffy, his museum, or to schedule a visit, go to StarkvilleCivilWarArsenal.com.